The first words a new member of the body spoke to his colleagues in the United States Senate, quote, "The people despise us all." With us today, the author of those words, the junior senator from Nebraska, Sen Sasse. Uncommon Knowledge now. Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Born in Plainview, Nebraska in 1972, Benjamin Eric Sasse received his undergraduate degree from Harvard, a master's degree from St. John's College, and a doctorate from Yale. In 2009, he became president of Midland University in Fremont, Nebraska, and within 4 years, he had replaced a budget deficit with a surplus and more than doubled the university's enrollment. In 2014, Sen Sasse was elected to the United States Senate. A Republican, he defeated his Democratic opponent by more than 2-1. Senator Sasse served in the Senate for a full year before rising to deliver his maiden address. When he did, speaking on November 3, 2015, he discussed the Senate himself, telling his 99 colleagues, "The people despise us all." Senator Sasse, welcome.
Thanks for having me. I don't sound very winsome there.
Well, I'll give you a chance to win your way out of it. The people despise us all. That's a very strong opening statement.
The approval rating of Congress is 9%, and my wife jokes, who are those 9% and how can she set them straight?
So you talked a lot in your maiden speech about the institution as an institution. In fact, it seemed to me I recognized thinking patterns that I've encountered in consultants. You used to be, for a time, with the Boston Consulting Group. Let me quote you. What if the Senate didn't exist? You asked everyone to engage in a thought experiment. What precisely would be lost if only we had a House of Representatives? And the answer to that is?
Well, the opportunity to have big and long and deep deliberation about the biggest national challenges. If you simply had a majoritarian body, and I think it's important to recognize both the distinction between the roles of the House and Senate, but you can only properly understand that if you're thinking in terms of the three branches to begin with. Our founders believed something really radical. They wanted to, in many ways, we want to be careful that we always define the word radical, because there's a lot of people today that are posing as conservatives who are actually radicals. But they believed something that was really unprecedented, that you should divide the powers of government. You actually fracture the authority. It's like something out of an old, Richard Pryor stir-crazy movie where you need two keys to the nuclear codes that are wider than anyone's wingspan. They wanted government to be really, really hard to operate, because most things in the world, when government acts, if it can act easily, it'll run over people's liberty. And so, first of all, you have to think about the three branches. And then inside the legislative branch, the Article I branch, we have two very different bodies in the House and the Senate. And I don't think we're doing the cultural and political catechesis of helping the public understand that the Senate has really different responsibilities than the House. The House is a majoritarian body and it has frequent elections, but Senate's different.
Okay. Again, I'm going to quote you. And you said in your maiden speech that you spent much of your first year interviewing your new colleagues. Again, very much like a consultant. You actually went door to door and talked to your fellow senators. Quote, "It's weird," I'm quoting you, "it's weird because one-on-one, when the cameras are off, hardly anyone here really believes that the senators from the other party are evilly motivated. There's actually a great deal of affection around here," close quote. So you've got this strange disjunction, which you and only 99 other people are in a position to judge, that it almost sounds as though at the human level, there's an opportunity for collegiality. What prevents it? What goes wrong when the cameras come on?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you put me in the Boston Consulting Group and McKinsey strategy consultant box for a minute, so I'll double down on it. I'll give you a 2x2 matrix on our whiteboard. Obviously, the Congress is a dysfunctional place. We've got big generational challenges in the country, and we're mostly not tackling them. And that isn't about this year. It's about this decade or this generation. Big problems.
How recently did Congress work?
Well, let's define what work meant. In the mid-1960s, there was a radical revisioning of what the federal government's role was in the 1964, 1965 Great Society program. Right, so we should celebrate the civil rights moment at the same time. But in the Great Society program, there was a radical expansion of the federal government's role in life. And it begged all sorts of questions about why we have limited government. We have limited government for a whole bunch of reasons that I hope we talk about some today. But after the 1960s, promises that were obviously bogus when they were made were never really revisited. The Medicare expenditure, the Congressional Budget Office equivalent from the mid-1960s that projected what will Medicare cost from 1965 to 1975, it was off by 1,100%. What Medicare as of 1975 was costing, the original projections had been that it would be 9% of what it was actually costing. Where are the adults that have tackled that problem that was a mess, obviously, by the mid-1970s? All sorts of things have been on autopilot since those mid-60s, and big problems are not being addressed.
So you're saying that it's half a century since the institution functioned?
I'm not precisely saying that, but I will say that America has big, if you sort of tried to think about, let's teach the American Revolution to the present day and create the sort of arc of what it means to have this really breathtaking experiment in self-governance. This idea, this big anthropological claim that humans are created with dignity and government doesn't give us rights, but government is a shared project to secure those rights. That idea has really been under assault in certain ways since the middle of industrialization. It's true that there was lots of complexity as the economy shifted from mostly agrarian to mostly urban and industrial.
I'm enjoying this, but you're shifting on me.
I know
You're no longer the Boston Consulting Group. Now we're talking to the Yale historian. That's fine. Okay, now that we've established that. So Grover Cleveland, Democrat, believes very strongly in limited government. Things are still intact. The founder's vision, I'm testing you this to see if you'll buy this. The founder's vision is still embraced by both parties for the most part, right up until what's the problem? Woodrow Wilson is our first trouble?
Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson have a really similar view of the
enormously
world.
expansionist.
Yeah.
They want to, okay.
So let's go ahead and build this map, because we should do the 2x2 matrix.
Let's go ahead.
The 2x2 is going to be nefariousness and efficacy. The problems of the Congress are not what people think they are.
Okay.
They're big and they're bad, but they're also different. Okay. So we'll get back to that, but let's make sure we understand why the 1960s are such a mess. And to do that, you can't just start by saying the 1960s are kind of an echo expansion of the New Deal. The New Deal and the Great Depression was a genuine crisis. And so at a certain level, the 1960s make a lot less sense historically as an attack on the American idea than the 1930s do when there was a real crisis. But you need to know what the intellectual forerunners were of that. And I think it is Woodrow Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt's progressivism that really regarded the constitutional structure, the Madisonian idea that we should separate power. They thought that was a clunky, bad idea that made it too hard for government to work.
They actually believed the founders got it wrong.
Absolutely.
Okay, little question within this larger question, then we go back to the 2x2.
Okay.
You sound as though you're with Ronald Reagan in the following sense. Reagan, actually this used to annoy me.
Let's just be with Reagan in almost every sense.
Exactly.
Let's just go there.
Fine with me, you can't go far wrong in my opinion. But the New Deal really never bothered him. The Great Society was where things went wrong in his view. And of course he had lived during the Depression and understood the ebullience of Franklin Roosevelt. But it sounds as though you're giving FDR and the New Deal something of a pass yourself. The intellectual trouble starts with FDR, I beg your pardon, with TR and Woodrow Wilson, and comes to terrible fruition in the 60s. And the New Deal is what? Where does it fit into that?
So let's unbundle two different kinds of problems with the New Deal. First, we should have lots of debates about Article 1, Section 8 and the Commerce Clause. We should have lots of general welfare debates, but let's set that aside. So I'm not going to give FDR a pass on everything because we've got real constitutional problems with what was happening.
That's another show, all right.
But anthropologically, there's a big difference between FDR's view of the world and LBJ's view of the world. FDR worried that we could create mass dependency.
Yes.
There was an intervention that he regarded as necessary. We should debate the constitutionality of that some other time or over scotch, but that's a different thing than being relatively indifferent to creating dependency. And LBJ is far worse than just indifferent about creating dependency. He thought there was political opportunity to be had in creating dependency. The growth of this city is mostly about the 1960s. It's not mostly about the 1930s.
Got it. Okay. And now your 2x2 matrix.
Yeah, I mean, I think when
What
you...
were the nefarious?
I've got a y-axis that's nefariousness, self-absorption, egotism, and an x-axis that is efficacy.
Okay.
And before I came here, I won't use any typology to name a specific member. In BCG, you'd really have in this 2x2, you'd put a cash cow, and you'd put you'd actually put faces of people in each of the four. But I think most Americans believe the outer quadrant is the big problem. You've got self-absorbed, egotistical jerks who have long-term plans. They may be nefarious plans, but they have a lot of strategic thinking and they have long-term plans. I think most of the problems of the Congress are an opposite quadrant problem. Most of the people of the 535 are really nice and well-meaning people, but there's a gigantic deficit of vision. We have generational challenges just at the level of federal policy. There are much bigger problems in America than things government could possibly tackle. The disintegration of families right now, the transformation of the economy, which Washington will never be able to be sufficiently in front of to lead the transformation from industrialism to whatever kind of knowledge or tech or service economy we're entering now. We have really big challenges in American life and American culture, but just at the level of federal policy, there are huge problems where most people in Washington feel like they're waiting for a crisis to be the exogenous event that now shakes us to get serious about things.
So most of your colleagues in the House and Senate are not Darth Vader, they're Gomer Pyle. They're just pretty well-intentioned, sweet folks who are bumbling along.
That sounds harsher than I mean to say it, but I'll just stop.
Well, nefariousness, I'm just trying, okay, yeah. All right. I'm quoting you. Ben Sasse's solution, also from your maiden speech to the Senate. Quote, and this too is arresting, quote, while I am in favor of more civility, my actual call here is for more substance. This is not a call for less fighting in the Senate, but for more meaningful fighting. Explain.
Some of the policy challenges we face. We don't have a long-term national security strategy for the age of cyber or for the age of jihad. So kind of a big deal. When you talk to military and national security experts off the record and you say, what are you losing sleep about? What do you think the country's national security challenges are going to look like in 10 years from now that we're not adequately investing in right now? About 98% of them, without even taking a breath, say cyber is going to transform the nature of warfare. Where are we debating that? Where are we having a meaningful discussion about the fact that we're going to have a generations-long battle with jihadists? We have entitlement budgets, as we mentioned a little bit ago, from the Medicare kickoff in 65 to 75, that don't possibly add up. There's no adult that looks at the books and says, well, mostly our entitlement programs will work themselves out. And the transformation of work that's going to happen. I was a college president, and when kids would walk across the stage and I would shake their hand and hand them a diploma, we know from demographers and economists that they're going to change not just jobs, but industries 3 times in the next decade. This is nothing like our parents'
what you're
economy.
asking for is a presidential vision, because we live in a presidential system, and that got decided sometime in the second half of the 19th century. God bless you, but that horse has left the barn. That horse is dead. It's so long ago. No? You think you can replace the Senate in the work of providing this country with a big long-term vision? You don't need a president for that. You can. How does that? What are you thinking there?
So first of all, let's just recognize that America is much, much, much bigger than the federal government. And so let's not start by identifying the two. Washington, that thinks it can solve every problem, will cause far more unintended mistakes, new troubles than anything they'll possibly solve. So first of all, we should have an American vision that can transcend what we think the federal government can get done. Then inside the federal government, we should want all 3 of these branches to all be vigorous defenders of a constitutional system of limited government. But then underneath that, policy initiative should ideally be coming, in the domestic policy space, should ideally be coming from the Article 1 legislative branch. Now, practically, I think that you're mostly right, that in the era of sort of formerly television and whatever's happening now with
whatever this is,
fractionalized, disintermediated world with infinite channels, and President Obama can appear in different hologram guys in different niches.
Right.
That's a problem, but it's the reality we're entering. And so you're going to have a big brand, a big personality as president that's going to have to help solve this stuff, no doubt. And yet we shouldn't want a European-style parliamentary system that's
right.
winner take all with the executive branch. We should yearn for more deliberation that can bring us together as a people, and the supermajoritarian requirements of the Senate. To go back to your opening questions about the difference between House and Senate, we should desire solutions that can bring along a lot of the American people. That happens in dialogue. That happens among people over dinner tables and 100 people who should get to know each other in the Senate, trying to not always put the worst construction on your opponent, your policy opponent's position. You should actually try to understand it before you reject it.
You said, again, one final quotation from your maiden speech, quote, "I believe that a cultural recovery inside the Senate is a prerequisite for national recovery. I don't think our long-term problems are solvable without a functioning Senate," close quote. So what is the prospect? You've got Leader McConnell saying, I may be off a little bit, but the statistics aren't going to be far off, that in his last year as majority leader, that is to say Harry Reid's last year, I believe there were 14 votes on the floor for amendments. And so far under Majority Leader McConnell, there are 200. Have been 200. He's very proud at opening up the chamber, restoring some semblance of even-handedness to the Senate. Is that working? Is there a generational change underway? You, Mike Lee, Barrasso, Joni Ernst, on and on. So what's the prospect for the Senate moving in the direction you'd like to see it move?
Yeah, so let's first of all talk about some really wonderful things that have happened here. I'll sound more partisan than my tone usually is, but the fact that Harry Reid has been retired as majority leader is a great thing for America. And the fact that Leader McConnell now has that agenda-setting power instead of Reid, that's a wonderful thing for America. And the voting point you make about, I think in the last year of the last Congress, they voted, I think it was 14 times, and it's something like 215 times in the first year this year. All those are really, really important improvements. I'm meaning to talk about something slightly different, though, because I think that regularly we think of the legislature's only responsibility as short-term legislation this month or this year.
Right.
And really, I think that the legislature's much bigger responsibility is to make sure that we're tending, and all three branches have this duty first, that we're tending to the cultural work of passing on a meaning of America, which requires in a republic an understanding of constitutionalism. And that means that you need a lot of oversight over the executive branch, and it means that the really big legislative changes that are necessary are probably the things that only come along every 10 or 15 or 20 or 25 years, not just the things that happen inside any given year of the Senate. And so I'll say something that's slightly pessimistic here, but my view of America and its potential for recovery and the wonderful inheritance that we have in the constitutional system is such that I'm really, really optimistic about America, but I'm short-term quite pessimistic about the federal government. I'll be blunt about that. And I think there are too many people in Washington that are waiting for big disruptive events like Greek-style debt crises or Israeli-like experiences of high-frequency, low-stakes jihadi attacks before they think they're going to get serious. And I think we should lead before the crisis.
Wow. All right. You gave your maiden speech on the Senate, and then you've given, I believe, the first of a series of speeches that you intend to give on constitutional government. And you devoted the first speech to the growth of executive unilateralism. What I've got is a text from December 17th, 2015. Quote, "The presidency began to grow large in the first two decades of the 20th century." We've discussed that. "It happened because presidents of both parties were willing to overreach," got that, "and because the Congress was willing to underreach." Close quote. Now, just at a human level, it's easy to see why a president would want to overreach. He's under pressures to do something. What's much harder to understand, I believe, is why somebody would go through all the work that somebody like you has had to go through to come to Washington, to become a member of the United States Senate, to become a member of the House. There are real sacrifices. It's hard work running a campaign and getting here and then underreaching. How come?
There are a lot of people who really love this as a job. And the easiest way to not get defeated, it appears, in many people's sort of framing of their challenge of reelection, is to not have to vote on hard things. And so I've heard from both Democrats and Republicans that have worked in the last few administrations that legislators come to them and they'd say, hey, could you by rule solve this problem for us? And even President Obama's White House has occasionally apparently said, it's not been said to me, obviously this is a intra-democratic conversation, but why do you need us to do this by rule? Why wouldn't you want to do it by legislation? You've got the votes, it's a 70-30 issue. Yeah, it is, but mostly I just want the outcome, and it turns out the 30%, they'll really be upset by it. And so I'd rather insulate this inside the executive branch so I don't have any accountability for the downside. There are a lot of people in Washington for whom the most important long-term issue they think about is their own incumbency. And so there is a long tradition, some of it again dating to the Great Depression and the New Deal response and to World War II. But by 1944, 45, 46, we see a real growth of executive branch agencies that are called regulatory, but are really doing things that are legislative.
Right. Okay, so now back to you as your in your capacity as a former consultant. What you just said is, if I may reframe it as if I had worked for BCG once myself, what you just said is people in this town do what people everywhere do. They respond to incentives.
Yes.
It's nice to be a member of Congress. For a lot of people, that's the biggest job they'll ever have. They want to hold on to it. And they just respond to incentives, ducking issues, raising money, getting reelected. How can you hope to reform the institution without changing the incentives? And how on earth do you do that?
Well, I don't have any grand electoral reform proposal for here, but I think we should just start by having a shared sense of what the problem is. And we are electing a lot of the wrong kinds of people. I mean, there was a vision that the founders had of lay governance. And you're right that campaigns are hard and long, although I also found that it was unbelievably comforting to find that grassroots Nebraska believes around their breakfast table what we believe around our breakfast table, which is kind of a Tocquevillian sense of America. That what
you campaigned for 16 months. Did you enjoy that?
I did, yeah. We have little kids. They're now 14, 12, and 4. So at that point, they were 12, 10, and 2. And not every piece of it was glorious. I remember about to head into a town hall one morning and pulling up at the moment the thing's about to start, and my 2-year-old is there at the little table area on the campaign RV. We call it a bus, but really it was something right out of Chevy Chase's Vacation. And my 2-year-old says, "I don't feel good, Dad," and then he just projectile vomits all over the place. And I'm holding him aside with one arm and trying to tell my wife, "I don't want to just hand him to you and leave the puke, but I need to go." So there were parts of it that weren't great, but Nebraska has 93 counties. We lived on and off that bus for 16 months. We did about 1,000 events, about 400 town halls over 16 months. And we were in all 93 counties again and again and again and again. And Nebraska is the largest cattle state in the union. And I grew up in an arable farming part of the state. So I grew up walking beans and detasseling corn, but
Your hometown is a population about 1,200, as I recall?
About 25,000, actually. So we're being swallowed by Omaha. Oh, the town that I was
Plainview,
born in was
Plainview,
1,200.
I'm sorry. Okay,
the town that I live in now is really where I was mostly raised.
Got it. Okay.
So 25,000 person ag-dependent town, an hour outside of Omaha. And I'd never grown up around cattle ranches. And on our trail, we were again and again and again at all these ranches. And my 14-year-old daughter leaves next month to go do cow-calf season for a month with one of these families. I want her to suffer badly. This is how she'll get character.
So listen,
that was a great experience.
Is there a partisan overlay here? You just said we're sending a lot of the wrong people to Washington. You're a Republican. Are more of the wrong people Democrats than Republicans? Is there some kind of, it is often said, for example, that Republicans tend to have better job opportunities. It's harder to recruit Republican candidates for Congress because they like the free market. And so if somebody's got a car dealership in Moline, he's doing pretty well. If, on the other hand, you've got a social worker in Moline, a Democrat, somebody who wants to see the bigger, then the Democrats have an easier time of recruiting it. Is there any kind of built-in asymmetry there that I can lure you into commenting on?
I've not thought about it exactly like that, but I will say that obviously in our current political continuum, Democrats are far more likely to believe if there's a problem, there must be a governmental solution. So government plays a larger role in most Democrats' worldviews than most Republicans. But I'm not willing to assent to the fact that every Democrat should err that way, because the difference between small government and limited government matters a lot. I'm for both of them. I'm for small government and I'm for limited government. But a debate between small and medium-sized government is a completely legitimate American debate. Sure. The continuum of, should we have a $15 minimum wage? I don't think so, because I think it will actually cause a lot of harm to people who need those rungs on the ladders of opportunity. I think it'll take away jobs for 15 to 18-year-olds. I think a bunch of things about why a $15 minimum wage is imprudent, but it's not un-American. And so I understand, and I want to have an empathetic presentation of why many Democrats want a $15 minimum wage. That's a different thing than failing to believe in limited government, which is at the core of our identity. So I don't want to totally bite.
Okay, Hugh, I'll lure that one back in and recast. While we're talking about executive unilateralism, you tweeted some questions to Donald Trump not long ago. And here you are, you produced a doctorate at Yale, which involved a major dissertation, and here you are compressing your thoughts down to 140 characters. Tweet, to quote one, directed from Senator Sasse to candidate Trump, "The president's job is not to run America." You're quoting Trump back to himself, "to run America. This is precisely Obama's error." Explain that.
Yeah. We believe that all three branches are separate but equal. Right. But the Article 2 branch, the executive, I mean, in some of the founders' deliberations, president wasn't even the term they used some of the time. They talked about the administrator, and president really just means presiding officer of the executive branch, and it's supposed to be somebody who takes an oath to faithfully execute the laws that were passed by the legislature.
Donald Trump displays no evidence that he has any constitutional understanding.
It is really hard to find him ever saying anything about limits and restraint and executive restraint, which, I'm not going to accuse him of any of these particular, ugly analogs. But many of the things that he says about winning and power and more of him, and I want to be really clear, I think a lot of the people that are supporting him are well-meaning people who appreciate his diagnosis.
Who are sick of the problem you just outlined.
Exactly.
The whole town needs to be turned upside down. And Donald says, vote for me, I'm going to go to that town and break furniture. And the impulse to support him is understandable.
Absolutely. And Donald Trump is also not explicable except following a mom jeans president who won't clearly declare that when we articulate a foreign policy, we should be really cautious and deliberate before we do it. But if we draw a red line, we should mean it. And our enemies should know that they should fear us and our allies should trust us. And so there's a lot to be frustrated about, the legislative branch and the current incumbent of the executive branch right now. And I get why a lot of people are appreciative of Donald Trump's diagnosis. And he'd be great to have a beer with. And he's funny, right? I mean, he's got charisma. I get all that. Where does he ever articulate a constitutional sense of the limits of the executive branch?
Okay, now let me put a question to you about the state of the republic, not Donald Trump, but the republic. I'm gathering from the conversation we've had so far that Democrats such as FDR and Harry Truman, right up through John Kennedy, are more or less okay with you because they understood the Constitution. FDR expands the federal government only experimentally in his notion, as you read it in his speeches, we're going to try this, we're going to try. There's a clear notion, if something doesn't work, we'll claw it back. And right through John Kennedy, you get a sense of limited government constitutional understanding. Now we have, in Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, candidates from both parties. Not only did the tradition disappear on the Democratic Party, but it looks as though it's this close to being swamped in the GOP. Is this correct?
I think the Democrats are basically a post-constitutional party, and I think what we're seeing in this primary season is that a lot of Republican voters are also content to be post-constitutional. The tragedies of policy in Washington are big. The tragedy of losing the Republican Party as a place from which you could reform, that's gigantic.
One more tweet to Donald Trump. Quote, you're writing to Donald, you brag about many affairs with married women. Have you repented to harm children and spouses? Do you think it matters? Close quote. We haven't touched on this, but Senator Sasse believes traditional morality belongs right in the middle of public life?
That's not what the tweet means. So what I think you see there is a rookie who's never been in politics before. I didn't expect CNN and New York Times headlines, Senator attacks Donald Trump over marital infidelities. The important verb in what I was writing was brag. Because what this is setting up, this was in a context of, I've asked Trump, I guess, 7 questions.
Right.
And I somewhat seriously said, these are sincerely asked questions, and I hope you'll answer sincerely, not
Lord
just
knows
by
he reads
insulting me.
He reads
And,
Twitter.
he responded by attacking me as a gym rat. He said that I look like somebody who belongs in the gym, not somebody who belongs in the U.S. Senate. But as the child of a high school football and wrestling coach, there's little higher praise for me than being called a gym rat. So I've decided to just full on embrace that. But I wish we could get him to engage some of the substance. I think there are a lot of great Americans supporting him, and they deserve the seriousness of him answering real questions. I've asked him 7 questions. Most of them were about policy. Some of them were about executive unilateralism and would he use. He says, to paraphrase here, if someone screws you, screw them back harder. Is that a guy that we want in charge of the IRS and the FBI? We had in 1960s and early 1970s that used governmental agencies as weapons against your opponents. We know the IRS has been misused in this administration. I don't have a lot of hope that a guy who says screw your enemies back harder is going to exercise prudential self-restraint about limited government in a limited office. So that's the context. But that particular tweet was setting up the next tweet, which was about his views of the Constitution. And so it was about oaths. And so it wasn't about his marital infidelities. Those are important questions, but not what I'm focused on. What I was focused on is the sort of Nietzschean oddity of someone bragging about bagging married women. Like it's one thing to say, as lots of people in their lives have experienced in the locker room, the kind of bragging about conquest. There's a different thing to say, I've had all these different kinds of women and I had a whole bunch of married women. That's weird. I've never seen anybody brag about that. And so it was about the oath-breaking question.
Got it. A few final questions here. One question concerns your life choices. So you grew up...
Did my mom put you up to this?
No, she didn't, but if she's listening, I'm doing my best, Mrs. Sasse. You grew up you're born in Plainview, population 1,200. You grew up in...
Fremont,
population about 25,000. And then you go to Harvard, and you have a doctorate from Yale, and you work at the Boston Consulting Group, and you get a big job at the Department of Justice, a job that was once held, by the way, by Antonin Scalia. And then you get a position teaching at the University of Texas, a big-time academic institution. You had chance after chance after chance to put small-town Nebraska behind you and become a member of what Charles Murray calls the new upper class. You could be making big money. A United States senator does fine, but you could be making big money and living in Boston or New York or Washington and surrounding yourself with people of your own educational attainment and income. And instead, as we've just discussed, you spent 16 months in a crazy Winnebago, crisscrossing cattle country in Nebraska, and you've got...
Sounds pretty darn good, doesn't it?
So I'm just asking, what are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing?
It'll sound too romantic, but I believe we're incredibly blessed. We live in the most exceptional nation in the history of the world, and it's based on an anthropological claim about the dignity of people. I really believe that people are created with dignity. The world has fallen. We need government to restrain certain kinds of evil and to create and maintain a framework for ordered liberty. But life is lived in neighborhoods in our cities and in small towns across cattle country. The center of the world is the Rotary Club in my town. The center of the world is your listeners' churches and synagogues and the small businesses that they're founding and the Little League and the PTA and the fire department. That is where life is lived. The textured, meaningful life is places where you actually have relationality in common and embodiment. And I want to live in the town I'm from. I want to raise my kids there, partly because we're close to all sorts of, corn operations where they can suffer in the summer. And we send our kids out to the fields. And we live right where we want to live. But I want my kids' friends, and I want your and my grandkids to grow up in a nation that believes in limited government because we believe in the nearly limitless potential of humans who have dignity.
Within 24 hours of the death of Justice Scalia, two views about filling his seat. On the one hand, the editorial board of the New York Times, within a few hours, quote, "The Senate must permit President Obama to replace him." On the other hand, Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, your Republican leader in the Senate, also within a few hours of the death of of Justice Scalia, immediately announced that the Senate would refuse to consider a nominee until after the presidential election. And Senator Sasse comes down where?
Well, we should always start these conversations at the level of principle. So I want to put the placeholder there to come back to that because your question centers on timing. Clearly, with this post-constitutional president in the middle of an election season, we should not be confirming an Obama progressive to the Supreme Court. But those timing questions, while important, are mostly things I'm going to leave to other people. I'm 99th in seniority. Literally, there's one
Who's
guy,
100th?
Dan Sullivan from Alaska. I shove him into a locker about once a week just to feel superior. We're not going to have any say over the timing of a calendar. And so I'm not going to spend my energy there. But I do think that this moment of the three branches coming together, which is an executive branch prerogative to nominate, a Senate prerogative and requirement to provide advice and consent, is so that you have a check on the creation of a new Supreme Court justice in the third branch, whose main responsibility on the court is to guard the people's liberties against an overreaching government. And so there is a huge didactic opportunity right here when these three branches come together to help the American people remember what we used to teach in civics about what the role of the court is. I ache at the level of waking up at night in a cold sweat whenever there's a Supreme Court vacancy and you hear yet another New York Times reporter talk about Republicans and Democrats on the court.
Obstruction, that's the word.
Oh, yes, but on the court, they name the justices as if they're Republicans and Democrats. I read my Constitution, I see no party affiliation in the Supreme Court justices, and even progressive and conservative is wrong because there are progressives and there are people who believe in doing their job, which is to hide anything about their own policy preferences. The job of a Supreme Court justice is not to be a super legislator. That would be an anti-democratic attack on a constitutional system where we, the people, are supposed to be in charge and be able to fire the legislators. And so if the court is going to be super legislators, they surely shouldn't have lifetime appointments. And so to call Scalia a conservative, as the papers have done all this week, misses the fundamental point. His job was to protect the rights of the people against bad laws that overreached. He was an originalist. He was a constitutionalist.
Last question. In a recent interview right here on Uncommon Knowledge, Hugh Hewitt, lawyer, commentator, said the following. Hugh Hewitt, by the way. I don't know if you know, he's an old friend. He's as conservative, and this is Hugh.
He believes too much in Ohio State Buckeye football, but other than that, I like the guy.
I'll let the two of you arm wrestle over that one. This is Hugh. Quote, "We may be seeing the eclipse of the Republic. I'm not an alarmist. It's not the end of the world. But even as the ancient Republic of Rome became a more imperial structure, our government has grown so large, its responsibilities so immense under the burdens of the modern world that it will be impossible to take back." Close quote. So Ben Sasse, God bless him, has identified a shift in power from the people to the permanent bureaucracy, but too late. Fight on, it's noble, it's a beautiful thing to watch you, to look at your tweets, to listen to your magnificent speeches in the Senate. God bless you, but it's too late. You are a last efflorescence of ideals that are already dead.
We need a constitutional recovery, and we need to bring along the Republic, which is 320 million souls. President Reagan, well before running for president or running for governor of California, when he was on the GE tour, teaching labor movement people along the railroad tracks where the GE factories were, What America means would say, in a republic, you're always only one generation away from the extinction of freedom. It only goes on if you teach it. And I do think there is an obsession of the 535 to think their job is small ball legislating. A huge part of our job is to be advocates and defenders and teachers and lovers of a constitutional system. And we have to teach that system to the next generation. So I'm with Hugh in that you can't talk about the decline of self-governance as the only thing that possibly matters in a world where the reason we believe in the American system of government is because of all these other aspects of what make full lives well lived and what define human flourishing outside of government. But I think we would be really naive to not be having the kind of conversation that Hugh wants to have about the risk of slipping from a republic to an empire.
It's not too late.
It's not too late, but we need to recognize this president has repeatedly talked like an emperor. We have a president who says, it isn't that big of a deal if the Congress doesn't pass the laws I want them to pass. I have a pen and I have a phone and I can just make it up as I go along. That sounds like something that you might have heard a certain moment in Rome's decline. And we now have a front runner in the Republican Party who says maybe President Obama has paved a new way as far as executive unilateralism goes. If you talk constantly about power and strength, and let's be clear, our foreign policy needs to be defined more by power and strength. And when you make political promises, you should keep your word with power and strength. And yet, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison did not believe when they became president that their aspiration should look like King George III. They believed they had a servant leadership responsibility underneath the Constitution. We're sitting here on February 22nd, and that's the typical commemoration of George Washington's birthday. And if you go back and read Washington's farewell address at the end of his 8 years as president, he worried that the constitutional system was in peril. So we're in uniquely troubled times, but not totally unique, because in our system, you always need to teach it to the next generation, and we've not been doing that.
Sen Sasse, Jr., Senator from Nebraska, who shares George Washington's birthday. Happy birthday, Senator.
Thank you.
Thank you. For Uncommon Knowledge and the Hoover Institution, I'm Peter Robinson.